So the other crucial element to understand about the coup attempt in Nicaragua is how fake news played a key role in this. And this goes back to the beginning of when the coup attempt began in April of 2018 here in Nicaragua. And there was fake news and media propaganda that played a key role in two ways. The first was that when the protests began, there was this narrative that was constructed that was entirely absurd to anyone that knew anything about Nicaraguan politics, but it was constructed to try to win over progressives. It was not targeting the right wing. You don't need to manufacture consent for the right wing. The right wing already wants a coup against Nicaragua. They already want a coup against Venezuela. Instead, this sophisticated fake news operation was targeting progressives and specifically the so-called Sandinistas. That's a term sometimes used for like the North Americans and the Europeans who came to Nicaragua in the 80s in solidarity with the revolution. And many of them turned against the Sandinistas when they came back to power in 2007. And we can talk about that later. But this propaganda operation was trying to portray the Sandinista government as implementing so-called neoliberal reforms, which is hilarious. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. It's blatant fake news. But what happened in April of 2018, at the beginning of the coup attempt, the inciting moment was that the government announced that they were doing these reforms to the social security system because this is a social security system that the Sandinistas inherited, the model they inherited from the neoliberals when they returned to power in 2007 through democratic elections. It was insolvent and it was going to go bankrupt. So they had to change the policies to make sure that the social security system did not go bankrupt. And in order to do that, the Sandinistas announced they were going to do a very slight increase on young people, not recipients of Social Security. People who already had Social Security would not have to pay anymore. But younger people would have to pay 1% more, and corporations would have to pay 3% more. So it was 75% of the increase was on private companies, and 25% of the increase was on young people. Now, okay, you can criticize that policy, but the vast majority, the bulk of the increase was on the private sector, was on corporations. So in response to that announcement, which by the way, that was not the announcement the IMF wanted. The IMF wanted a total neoliberal reform, which of course the Sandinista government refused to support. So they issued that reform, which puts the majority of the increase on private corporations. So in response to that, the COSEP, which is the Chamber of Commerce in Nicaragua, which is controlled by the right wing, obviously, it's a main source of corporate power of the oligarchy. It was COSEP, the Chamber of Commerce, that called for protests against the Nicaraguan government's reforms because they wanted the IMF reforms. COSEP explicitly said, we want the IMF reforms, which would not have increased taxes on corporations, but rather would have put the burden entirely on working people, which is explicitly neoliberal. The government's reforms were not neoliberal. So what happened is that in April of 2018, with the confusion there was this narrative created that the government is doing this unpopular reform, and students began to protest. And when the students began protesting, that is when the coup operation, which had clearly been planned for months or years in advance, with especially figures like Felix Maradiaga, got involved. Now, Felix Maradiaga is not a student. If you don't know who he is, Felix Maradiaga is one of the main coup leaders. He has a fake NGO that was funded by the US government. Felix Maradiaga has been cultivated by regime change networks going back a decade, specifically to the World Economic Forum. Felix Maradiaga is a rich businessman in Nicaragua and participated in numerous World Economic Forums, that is Davos conferences. And there's so many videos of him in the United States with the Harvard Kennedy School, where he studied alongside Juan Guaido and Carlos Vecchio, the main leaders of the coup attempt in Venezuela. He also studied in Chicago. So he's been cultivated for over a decade by these elite institutions, by the World Economic Forum. His wife, Berta Valle, is now one of the key, is the part of the core of the Nicaragua coup lobby in Miami. She moved to Miami after the coup attempt failed. And Berta Valle, like her husband, Felix Maradiaga, has also been cultivated by the World Economic Forum. So when the students start their protests, that is when the violent elements, the extremist elements, the drug-linked elements began to make the situation very violent and to militarize the situation, like what happened in Syria.